It began not in Washington nor in Berlin, but in a quiet red brick building at the University of Birmingham on a rain-soaked day in March 1940. Two men, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, hunched over a battered oak desk, the smell of damp paper and coal smoke hanging thick around them. Both were refugees, stripped of their homeland by the rise of Hitler, and now serving the country that had given them shelter. They were British citizens in all but passport, and in that moment they were about to give Britain the most terrifying advantage in the history of mankind. The world believed an atomic bomb would require tons of uranium. German scientists thought it impossible. American physicists called it a fantasy. But in their cramped office, Peierls' slide rule clicked, and Frisch's pencil scratched the final line of an equation that changed everything. Their calculations showed that a single bomb, using only a few kilograms of uranium-235, could unleash the explosive power of thousands of tons of TNT. 1 pound, not 1 ton. 1 bomb, not 1 army. They typed their results in the now legendary Frisch-Peierls memorandum. 3 pages, double-spaced, stamped secret. Frisch later wrote, "We stared at each other in silence. We both understood what we had done. Britain suddenly held the key to the most destructive weapon in human history." The memo predicted that an aircraft could carry the bomb, that it would destroy a city in seconds, and that no defence on Earth could stop it. The paper was sent through military channels to the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence, codenamed MEORD. Within weeks, the Royal Air Force's Intelligence Division had grasped the scale of what this meant. Britain, blockaded, bombed, and barely breathing under the Blitz, was now years ahead of every nation on Earth in atomic theory. It was the ultimate irony. While the Luftwaffe scorched London, 2 British-based refugees had already invented the weapon that could end the Reich. Peierls told his wife later that night, "I think we've opened Pandora's box." She replied softly, "Then at least it's in the right hands." That memo crossed Churchill's desk by summer. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and said, "This changes everything." And it did. From that damp Birmingham room, the path to Hiroshima began, and Britain had drawn the map. It began with a single question, whispered inside a London basement during the autumn of 1941. What if Britain could build the bomb before anyone else? The Blitz was still raging overhead, the smell of smoke and burnt brick drifting through every cracked window of Whitehall. Deep below, behind steel doors and blackout curtains, a handful of British scientists and military officials formed a project so secret its name sounded meaningless: Tube Alloys. The world would soon learn that beneath that dull title hid the deadliest research programme on Earth. Churchill's advisers had read the Frisch-Peierls memorandum and knew the math was no fantasy. The British could do it, but they needed speed, they needed power. They needed factories that could spin uranium gas through filters at speeds no machine had yet survived. By December 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, Britain's scientific community, under the guidance of Sir George Thompson, Sir James Chadwick, and physicist Mark Oliphant, had already produced the first practical designs for atomic separation. They worked with makeshift tools, some of them salvaged from bombed laboratories, yet their output stunned even the Americans. The MEORD Committee's final report, delivered in July 1941, estimated the bomb could be built within 2 years. It declared, "The bomb is not only possible, it is inevitable." That line alone froze Washington. General Leslie Groves, then a colonel, later admitted, "The MEORD report was the first real spark that started us moving." Britain had just detonated the starting pistol for the Manhattan Project without even knowing it. At a time when British aircraft factories were being hit nightly and steel was rationed to the ounce, These men pursued atomic perfection. They improvised vacuum chambers from tea kettles and calibrated Geiger counters beside blackout candles. Every calculation written by candlelight in London meant months shaved off America's later timetable. And still, the British kept it secret, even from their closest allies. When the Americans finally saw a copy of the Maud report, they were speechless. One official muttered, "We thought they were bluffing." They weren't. The Americans had industry, but Britain had the idea. Tube alloys became the invisible bridge that carried British intellect straight into the heart of the Manhattan Project. In the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill said to his aides, "We shall give them the weapon, but never the soul behind it." The storm was coming, and Britain had already summoned the lightning. In the sweltering heat of August 1941, an RAF Liberator lifted off from London bound for Washington, D.C. Inside, wedged between medical cargo and radio crates, sat a wiry, balding physicist named Mark Oliphant. He wore a creased brown suit, horn-rimmed glasses, and carried a black leather briefcase locked with brass clasps. Inside that case was the Maud report, the British blueprint for the atomic bomb. His mission? Shake America out of its scientific slumber. Oliphant had read the Americans' recent assessments. They called the bomb theoretical, something for textbooks, not trenches. It made him furious. Britain didn't have the luxury of theory. London was burning. Coventry had already been flattened. Every hour wasted might be another 1,000 dead. He had no patience left for caution. As soon as his wheels hit the tarmac, he skipped formalities and stormed into the offices of Lawrence, Bush and Compton, three of America's top wartime physicists. "You're going too slow," he told them. "This is real, and it works." He dropped the report on their table with a thud that seemed to shake the room. "Read it, or lose the war." That document didn't just outline the bomb. It contained Britain's entire progress. Tube alloys had proven that gaseous diffusion could isolate uranium-235. It described the chemical chain reactions and even listed prototype centrifuge models. Within 48 hours, panic hit the US War Department. British science had outpaced every lab in America. Ernest Lawrence, Nobel laureate and builder of the American cyclotron, later said, "Oliphant's arrival was the turning point. He made us realize we were behind." General Groves, still weeks away from leading the Manhattan Project, was brought in for emergency briefings. Britain had detonated a scientific bomb in the heart of American bureaucracy. By October, the United States began drawing up plans for a national program. Within 6 months, the Manhattan Project would be born, but only because a British scientist carried truth across an ocean in a single suitcase. One American officer wrote in his journal, "The Brits just kicked the door down. They didn't ask us to believe. They brought the proof." That briefcase weighed less than 6 pounds, but inside it carried the future of warfare, and it had a Union Jack stamped under its brass locks. In the icy January of 1944, a convoy rolled through the snow-covered gates of Los Alamos. Among the arrivals was a quiet British physicist named Rudolf Peierls, wearing a threadbare coat, wool gloves, and carrying a notebook wrapped in oilskin. He was not loud, not famous, but inside that notebook was the math that would unlock the most difficult riddle of the atomic age: how to crush a bomb into a star. The Americans were stuck. Their uranium gun-type bomb was straightforward, but plutonium's volatility demanded a more complex solution: implosion. Every attempt to force an even detonation inward had failed. Calculations spiraled out of control. Then Peierls arrived, calm, precise, and deadly brilliant. He had already co-authored the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum. Now he would tackle implosion, not just in theory, but in practice. General Groves assigned Peierls to work under Seth Neddermeyer, but it soon became clear the British thinker was leading the charge. His approach was elegant. Use timed explosive lenses to compress plutonium to critical mass. The technique required shaping the blast waves with mind-bending precision. Peierls described it like trying to pat a balloon from all sides at once and make it shrink without popping. Working 12-hour shifts in Building D10, surrounded by chalkboards filled with integrals and variables, Peierls began refining the models. He wore the same boiled wool jumper every day and was known to pause mid-equation to pour black tea from a dented flask his wife had packed in Oxford. His notes, scrawled in crisp Germanic script, became gospel among the Americans. When the final implosion design was tested, Robert Christie, another physicist, credited Peierls with shaping the math that made it possible. Oppenheimer, ever poetic, said, "It was Peierls who turned the storm inward." But not all victories come without shadows. After the war, Peierls confided to his daughter, "I built something to defeat monsters, but I didn't see the one it would become." In that moment, the brilliance of British science met the weight of British conscience. Still, without Peierls, the implosion design might never have worked. The Nagasaki bomb, codenamed Fat Man, owed its very breath to a British pen, a British mind, and a British sense of duty. And as the bomb roared to life in New Mexico's desert, one truth became inescapable. The world's most feared weapon had British fingerprints pressed into every bolt. It was August 19th, 1943. In the highlands of Quebec, two world leaders met under heavy guard inside the Chateau Frontenac, its stone halls echoing with the weight of war. One man, cigar in hand and fire in his voice, refused to let Britain's greatest secret be handed over without terms. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of a nation under siege, faced Franklin D. Roosevelt, leader of the rising American superpower. Between them sat a document that would decide who owned the future, the Quebec Agreement. By then, Britain had already given more than the Americans realized. The Maud Report, the designs for enrichment, and the implosion theory had all originated in British labs. And yet, the size of America's industrial machine threatened to swallow the whole effort. Churchill knew that to win the war, Britain had to share the bomb. But he also knew what it meant to give up the soul of it. He laid out one demand: joint control. The agreement must state in writing that neither Britain nor America could use the atomic bomb without the other's consent. Roosevelt agreed. Clause 4 of the Quebec Agreement read, "The bomb shall not be used against any third party without the mutual consent of both countries." Churchill had just locked Britain's hand to America's trigger. This wasn't charity. Britain entered the Manhattan Project not as a junior partner, but as the nation that had sparked its very existence. British scientists were embedded at every level, from Penny at implosion to Oliphant in electromagnetic separation, to Chadwick overseeing the entire British mission. The American labs called them the infiltrators. But what they brought wasn't sabotage. It was salvation. Churchill later wrote in his diary, "We are giving them the thunderbolt. Let us pray they wield it with reason." The power had shifted west, but Britain still held the moral compass. As the ink dried on the Quebec Agreement, a stunned American general turned to his aide and muttered, "They're handing us the greatest weapon ever made and asking us not to use it alone. That's not weakness, that's civilization." And just like that, the bomb became a shared burden. British in thought, American in steel. But every future explosion would echo with Churchill's condition. This weapon, born of British minds, would never again be used without a whisper from across the sea. In the sharp winter of 1945, as snow settled over the brick chimneys of Harwell Laboratory in Oxfordshire, MI5 officers stormed into the home of one of Britain's most decorated physicists. Klaus Fuchs, a quiet, bespectacled man with a pipe always clamped between his teeth, calmly looked up from his desk and said only 4 words: "You've come for me." He was right. They had. Fuchs was no ordinary scientist. He'd been part of the British team at Los Alamos, worked side by side with the Americans on implosion theory, and had touched nearly every classified page of the plutonium project. Born in Germany, raised in anti-Nazi politics, and naturalized in Britain, Fuchs embodied the complexity of war. He fled Hitler, embraced British values, then betrayed both Britain and America, but not for money. He believed the world should never have just one atomic power. From 1943 to 1947, Fuchs passed secrets to the Soviet Union: equations, blueprints, the exact configuration of the Fat Man bomb. Each memo he handed over pushed Stalin years ahead. When the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949, it wasn't just a victory for Moscow. It was the shadow of Britain's science reflected through treason. And yet, Fuchs was also a product of Britain's trust. He'd earned the respect of James Chadwick, who vouched for him. He dined with Penny. He stood in the very meetings where implosion thresholds were finalized. The Americans later admitted he knew almost as much as Oppenheimer. His arrest shocked both nations. General Groves, red-faced with disbelief, slammed his fist and shouted, "The Brits let us spy into the centre of the bomb!" But they hadn't. They'd let in a genius who happened to be loyal to an idea rather than a country. At his trial, Fuchs never denied a thing. "I thought no nation should have this power alone," he said. He was sentenced to 14 years, but served only 9. Yet the deeper story wasn't just about betrayal, it was about how indispensable Britain's scientists had become. So indispensable that even our traitors moved history forward. When asked later if he regretted trusting Fuchs, Chadwick simply replied, "He built what we could not afford to delay. Sometimes genius walks with devils." And still, the bomb bore a British mind at every turn, even the ones wrapped in silence and snow. The desert of New Mexico stretched flat under a June sun in 1945, dust devils spinning across the dry basin. Inside the guarded perimeter of Los Alamos, where chain-link fences met armed patrols, and even the lizards seemed afraid to blink, one fact defied belief. The British mission, numbering fewer than 20 scientists, was responsible for breakthroughs that rivaled the work of hundreds of Americans. They called them the 10 men who held up the mountain. Names like James Chadwick, William Penny, Otto Frisch, Egon Bretscher, and Ernest Titterton echoed through the lab halls. These weren't advisors. They were doers, designers. Theoretical architects of implosion, enrichment, detonation, synchronization. Americans had size, but Britain had precision. Sir James Chadwick, who had discovered the neutron in 1932, was treated as a living legend. He moved quietly through the Los Alamos compound in his grey overcoat, always carrying his own chalk. When the Americans stalled on plutonium weaponization, it was Penny, a British physicist with a schoolmaster's frown and a saboteur's cunning, who cracked the timing issue for implosion. His equations would go directly into the design of the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Even when sidelined by American secrecy, the British scientists never stopped delivering. Frisch helped design criticality safety protocols. His own work would later save dozens of lives. Titterton operated diagnostic equipment during the Trinity test and helped calibrate the final blast yield. And they did it all while officially on loan from a country still rationing tea, meat, and ink. In fact, British labs had been so stripped bare by the Blitz that many arrived with their own tools, voltmeters wrapped in scarves, hand-built capacitors hidden in suitcases. Yet, when Oppenheimer wrote his summary memo of the final implosion trials, 2/3 of the critical math had British initials beside it. A Los Alamos engineer once quipped, "If you removed the Brits, the bomb would have been months late, or wrong." The Americans built the factories. Britain supplied the brain cells, a ratio of 10-1 in manpower, in resources, even in staff, yet the British team delivered innovations on nearly equal footing. That's not contribution, that's dominance in miniature. On July 16, 1945, when Trinity's mushroom cloud clawed into the sky, a young American physicist whispered, "They did it." He wasn't speaking of Oppenheimer or Groves. He was watching Chadwick and Penny, their faces lit orange by a sunrise they helped ignite. When the first shockwaves of the Trinity test thundered across the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, James Chadwick did not cheer. He stood apart from the crowd, hands behind his back, lips pressed tight. This was the man who had discovered the neutron, the invisible particle that made the bomb possible. Yet his eyes were filled not with triumph, but with something closer to grief. He whispered to a colleague beside him, "I am not proud of what we did." Chadwick had carried the weight longer than anyone. From the very first calculation in the early 30s to the bomb's final assembly, he had been the ghost in the machine, guiding, correcting, warning. He had written the final Meade report back in Britain, the very document that launched the entire Manhattan Project. Without him, there was no bomb. And yet, as the sky tore open and the desert glowed, he felt nothing like victory. He wasn't alone. Otto Frisch, who had helped define nuclear fission, refused to watch the blast. He sat in a bunker, back-turned, scribbling equations by lantern light, as if to bury himself in math and avoid the fire outside. Later, he wrote in his journal, "We did not know how to stop the thing we had made." It was a uniquely British response, not regret for winning, but sorrow for the scale of what had been necessary. Britain had fought with morality in its teeth. From resisting the Blitz to liberating Europe, its victory was always tied to purpose. And so, when the ultimate weapon roared, it struck harder in the hearts of the men who had first imagined it. Penny, too, who had run blast yield simulations for Fat Man, later admitted, "We'd ended the war, but also changed humanity." After the war, he would lead Britain's own nuclear program, but with strict safeguards and international oversight. He called it a sword we must sheathe in reason. These were not men chasing power, they were chasing survival. And when they found power, absolute, unchallengeable power, it did not make them kings, it made them cautious. That's what made the British different. Others dropped the bomb. Britain felt its weight. They invented a weapon and taught the world how to fear it, and then showed how to live with that fear without losing our soul. In the waning summer of 1945, as victory flags fluttered across Europe and Pacific fleets closed in on Japan, Winston Churchill sat in his study at Chartwell, pen poised above parchment. He was no longer Prime Minister, replaced weeks earlier in a shock election, but his mind remained sharp, burning with unfinished business. In front of him lay a half-written letter to President Harry S. Truman. The words were measured, but the message was clear. Britain must never be frozen out of the atomic age it had created. Churchill had watched, from the sidelines, as the United States dropped 2 bombs, one over Hiroshima on August 6th, and another over Nagasaki 3 days later. He knew that without British brains, Chadwick, Oliphant, Peierls, those bombs would have come too late, or not at all. Yet now America was moving swiftly, preparing to claim sole control of the atom. Project Alsos had locked down German nuclear assets. New laboratories were rising in Oak Ridge and Hanford, and Washington's tone had shifted. The Quebec Agreement's mutual consent clause was already fraying. The letter Churchill drafted was never sent, But historians would later quote lines from his private notes. "We gave them the thunderbolt. We must not let it be turned back upon us." He knew power without partnership was betrayal. And though he had stepped away from office, Churchill still considered Britain the moral steward of the bomb, not its owner, but its conscience. Back in America, General Groves pushed for exclusion. "We don't owe them anything," he told his staff. But scientists at Los Alamos disagreed. Robert Oppenheimer himself argued, "The British were the seed, we were the soil. You cannot deny the root." Still, the US would pass the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, effectively cutting Britain out of post-war nuclear development. It was a diplomatic fracture born not of mistrust, but of sheer ambition. And yet, Britain refused to fade. Less than 4 years later, under the guidance of William Penny, Britain detonated its own bomb off the coast of Australia. Codenamed Operation Hurricane, it proved that the British did not need permission, only principle. Churchill's unsent letter remains one of the most haunting artifacts of the nuclear age, and not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't have to say. Britain had already spoken through science, sacrifice, and silence, and the world had listened. On the evening of August 6, 1945, 6 German scientists gathered around a radio at Farm Hall, a stately manor in the English countryside turned secret POW wiretap site. Among them sat Werner Heisenberg, Hitler's prized physicist and head of Nazi Germany's atomic program. Crackling through the speakers came the BBC report. An American bomber had dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was disbelief. Then came the question that cut the room in half. Did the Americans really do it? Or was it the British? Unbeknownst to the scientists, every word they uttered was being recorded by British intelligence. Operation Epsilon had wired the manor with hidden microphones to monitor what Germany's best nuclear minds would say once they realized they had lost. The answers revealed everything. Heisenberg muttered, "I don't believe it." Von Weizsäcker added, "I think it's probably the Americans, but I bet the British had a hand in it." Then, after hours of stunned analysis, Kurt Diebner, another senior Nazi physicist, had admitted, "We were nowhere near this. We didn't even have a working reactor." That night, Germany's most brilliant scientific minds realized the bitter truth. They had never stood a chance. The race hadn't been close. The British, without their own bomb, had still beaten them to the finish line through intelligence, vision, and collaboration. The transcripts show their admiration turned quickly to envy. Heisenberg, once so confident in German supremacy, now questioned everything. How could they have gotten the necessary U-235, he asked aloud. The answer, whispered by von Lau, was chillingly simple. They worked together. We did not. It was the ultimate acknowledgement. The enemy, broken and isolated, had come to understand what the Allies already knew. That British science, not German ambition, had defined the war's outcome. From Frisch and Piles to Chadwick and Penny, the British minds who fled Hitler had not only escaped, they had outthought the Reich itself. While Germany chased fantasies, Britain turned scribbled memos into firestorms, and now, in a quiet manor in Cambridgeshire, the defeated acknowledged it. As the room fell quiet again, one final voice broke through. "The war is over," Heisenberg said. "The world belongs to the men who made this bomb." He paused, then added, "And they were not German." Between the autumn of 1940 and the spring of 1943, the British government spent just over £2 million on atomic research. That figure, buried deep in wartime ledgers under the codename Tube Alloys, would spark a chain reaction that forced America to launch the most expensive weapons project in human history. The Manhattan Project would cost nearly $2 billion, over $6 billion in today's terms, and stretch across dozens of secret sites, thousands of scientists, and entire cities built from scratch. The impossible stat? Britain's £2 million became the blueprint for America's $2 billion bomb. This wasn't just fiscal genius, it was wartime foresight. At a time when Britain was rationing bread, sacrificing meat, and melting church bells for copper, Churchill's War Cabinet approved Tube Alloy's funding on nothing more than a memo and a set of handwritten equations. There were no test reactors, no enriched fuel. Only men like Chadwick and Oliphant who knew the math and trusted the mission. The numbers make jaws drop. A single British team of fewer than 20 scientists produced the Frisch-Peierls calculation, the Mayud report, and a working knowledge of isotope separation, all for less than the cost of a single Royal Navy destroyer. Meanwhile, America, without these documents, had projected the bomb to be at least a decade away. Britain shaved off 7 years and handed Washington a fast lane to Armageddon. An American War Production Board memo in early 1944 noted, "The British spent wisely. Every pound was equal to 1,000 of ours." The return on investment? Victory. And the moral burden that came with it. But this wasn't about money. It was about value. British labs, many still repairing Blitz damage, worked miracles with what they had. Frisch calibrated his experiments using salvaged lab glass. Oliphant modified hospital equipment to build a makeshift cyclotron. Penny ran timing tests on detonators using old naval rangefinders. Every workaround became an innovation. At war's end, Churchill reviewed the cost breakdowns in a classified memo and remarked, "We did not build the bomb, we made it possible. They forged it in steel, we delivered it in thought." £2 million. A sum so small it wouldn't fund a modern motorway tunnel. Yet it bought a head start on the weapon that ended a world war. In the twilight of his life, Rudolf Peierls sat in a quiet Oxford garden, the summer breeze rustling through hedgerows, while war felt like a dream half forgotten. He was the man who had first proven that a bomb could be built with a handful of uranium, the father of the implosion theory, the British scientist whose name appeared in nearly every corner of the Manhattan Project. And yet, when asked in a BBC interview whether he was proud, he didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "I never imagined our work would lead to so much death." This was the final truth the world rarely hears. The British built the atomic bomb with unmatched brilliance, and then lived with unmatched conscience. After Hiroshima, Peierls withdrew from weapons research entirely. So did James Chadwick, who had written the Maud report. Otto Frisch turned to peaceful atomic applications, refusing military contracts. William Penny, who had calculated the yield of the Nagasaki bomb, would later lead Britain's nuclear program with heavy safeguards, never forgetting what it meant to wield power without wisdom. This is where British greatness separated itself from all others, not just in creation, but in reflection. America built the factories. Britain carried the soul. In 1952, when Britain detonated its first atomic bomb, Operation Hurricane, the test was conducted under strict conditions, offshore, remote, and with maximum containment. Penny, now Sir William, oversaw every detail. He ordered extensive radiation shielding, doubled the safety margins, and brought in foreign observers to verify transparency. He called it a weapon of last resort and first responsibility. The burden Britain carried was not shame, it was stewardship. We had given the world the keys to the atom. We had lit the first spark, guided the first hands, and written the first equation that made the impossible real. And when the fire raged, we stood back, not in cowardice, but in principle. Others dropped the bomb, Britain dropped the idea, and then never stopped questioning it. In his final lecture, Peierls told a classroom of young physicists, "The power to destroy must come with the wisdom to hesitate." Then he smiled, folded his notes, and left the hall to quiet applause. That is Britain's legacy. We did not invent war. We invented the thought that could end it, and dared to feel its weight.